The sound of the slap echoed through the sterile white hallway of the maternity ward like a gunshot. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The fluorescent lights flickered above. The faint beeping of distant monitors droned on, and everyone around fell silent. A pregnant woman, her eyes brimming with shock and pain, staggered backward, her hand instinctively covering her swollen belly, as if shielding her unborn child from a world that had just shown its cruelty. The man who had struck her was no ordinary figure. He was a powerful CEO, a man who commanded boardrooms with fear, whose wealth and influence stretched farther than most could imagine. Yet in that moment, stripped of pretense, he was nothing but a coward. What he didn't know, what he could never have prepared for, was that the nurse rushing to her side was not just a nurse. She was her sister. And not just any sister. She was a battle-hardened combat medic who had seen life, death, and the raw edge of humanity. This was not a woman who would stand by quietly. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and standing up against injustice, then please pause for a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Stories Collection. By supporting, you help us spread more powerful stories that remind us of courage, love, and resilience. Her name was Emily. She had been trained in war zones, patching up soldiers under enemy fire, holding the hands of the wounded as helicopters roared overhead. She had seen the worst of humanity and the best, sometimes in the same breath. But nothing prepared her for the sight of her own sister, Claire, clutching her stomach in agony, tears streaming down her cheeks after being struck by the man who vowed to love and protect her. Emily's heart raced, her instincts sharpened. She dropped the chart in her hand and was instantly at Claire's side, her arm sliding under her to steady her. The CEO, Marcus, stood above them, his hand still half raised, his face twisted in anger, yet his eyes betraying a flicker of regret. But regret meant nothing. The damage had already been done. Claire had always been delicate, soft, spoken, the kind of woman whose warmth could light up a room. Yet she had fallen in love with Marcus when he was still building his empire, when his charm masked the shadows in his heart. She believed in him, stood by him, gave him her loyalty, and now she was carrying his child. But power changes people. Success corrupted Marcus. Boardroom battles hardened him, and greed left no room for compassion. What began as small cruelties, sharp words, neglect, cold silences, had escalated into violence. And now it had reached its ugliest form. Here in a hospital where new life was meant to be celebrated, not crushed. Emily steadied Claire into a nearby chair, her medic instincts scanning for signs of distress. Claire's breathing was shallow, her skin pale, her eyes dazed. The child had to be protected. The oath Emily had lived by on battlefields flared inside her. Never lose a life if it can be saved. She pressed her palm gently against Claire's belly, whispering silent promises that no harm would come while she lived. Marcus hovered nearby, his voice rising with excuses, trying to paint Claire as overdramatic, ungrateful, unstable. But his words rang hollow against the reality of her trembling form. Emily's eyes met his, and for the first time in his life, Marcus found himself face to face with a fury that could not be bought, silenced, or intimidated. The hours that followed were a blur of tests, monitors, and whispered reassurances. Emily never left her sister's side. She remembered the soldiers she had kept alive with nothing but scraps of medical gear, the nights she had stayed awake in muddy trenches, and she realized that this fight for her sister and unborn niece or nephew was no less a battlefield. Claire's tears broke Emily's heart. She confessed in fragments that this was not the first time Marcus had raised his hand. Shame had chained her silence, fear had kept her bound. But that night, when the slap reverberated through the hospital halls, the chains cracked. She had someone beside her now who would not allow her to walk back into darkness. Emily reported everything. Her training, her courage, her years in combat had given her a backbone of steel. She alerted hospital security, involved social workers, and made sure records of Marcus's violence were filed. For once, Marcus's money couldn't buy him a clean escape. Whispers began circulating among the staff, stories of the CEO's public image, his glamorous lifestyle, his ruthless drive, now colliding with the ugly truth no PR team could bury. But the struggle wasn't only with Marcus. Claire's heart was torn. She still loved him, or at least the version of him she once knew, the man she believed he could be. She feared the future, feared raising a child alone, feared the shame of a broken marriage. Emily saw the war inside her sister's eyes. And so, she became not just her medic, but her warrior, her shield, her strength. She reminded Claire of the battles she had survived in life, the dreams she still carried, the worth she had forgotten under Marcus's shadow. Days turned into weeks. Marcus tried to force his way back, sending expensive gifts, begging for forgiveness, threatening lawsuits, alternating between charm and menace. But Emily stood like a wall. She reminded Claire that love without respect is a prison, that wealth without kindness is emptiness, that no child deserves to grow up in fear. Slowly, painfully, Claire began to see the truth. She started holding her head higher, speaking with more certainty, making decisions for herself and her unborn baby. The turning point came during a hospital charity event. Marcus arrived uninvited, dressed in a $1,000 suit, cameras flashing around him. He tried to spin the narrative, painting himself as the devoted husband checking on his wife. But when he reached for Claire's hand, Emily stepped in between them. Her voice was calm, but carried the weight of every battlefield she had ever walked. She told the truth aloud, in front of everyone. Stripping Marcus of his mask, silence fell. Then whispers grew into outrage. That night, Marcus's empire began to crumble. Not because Emily had destroyed him, but because he had destroyed himself. Claire gave birth weeks later. The moment she held her baby in her arms, tears streamed down her face, washing away years of fear and silence. Emily stood beside her, exhausted but proud, knowing this was a victory worth more than any medal pinned on her uniform. It was a victory of love over violence, of courage over fear, of family over betrayal. Life wasn't instantly perfect. Claire had to rebuild, brick by brick, learning to trust herself again, to raise her child with strength and tenderness. But she was no longer alone. Emily was there, every step of the way, her combat scars reminding her that battles may wound, but they also forge warriors. And Claire was becoming one herself. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of the importance of protecting those we love and standing against cruelty, please take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Stories Collection. Your support helps us bring more powerful, true, to life stories to light. Before we end, we have a special request. Comment below. What lesson this story left in your heart? Was it courage? Was it the reminder of family? Or the belief that second chances come not from abusers, but from finding the strength to walk away? The sound of the slap was so sharp, so sudden, that it seemed to echo endlessly through the white, sterile corridor of the maternity ward. Nurses froze in place, patients turned their heads, and even the faint beeping of monitors seemed to pause for one dreadful heartbeat. Claire staggered back, her hand instinctively clutching her swollen belly, as though her arms alone could shield her unborn child from the cruelty that had just struck her. Her eyes widened in disbelief, a mix of shock and heartbreak spilling across her face. That hand, the same hand that once promised to hold her through storms, had now betrayed her in the most violent way. The man standing before her, Marcus Hale, was not just any husband. He was a powerful CEO whose name carried weight in business circles, whose cold efficiency and ruthless charm had built an empire. In public, he was untouchable, admired, envied. But here, stripped of flashing cameras and polite applause, he was revealed for what he truly was, a coward who had just raised his hand against his pregnant wife. What Marcus never expected was who would come rushing to Claire's side. A nurse, tall and strong, dropped her patient chart to the floor and was at Claire's side in an instant. But she was no ordinary nurse. Her name was Emily, Claire's sister, and beyond the walls of this hospital, Emily was a combat medic, a woman who had patched soldiers under gunfire, who had held dying men's hands while mortar shells shook the ground, who had seen what true strength and true love looked like in the rawest corners of war. And now, that strength was standing face to face with Marcus Hale. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and standing against cruelty, please take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Stories Collection. Together, we can spread more stories that inspire courage, compassion, and hope. Emily caught her sister before she could collapse. She steadied Claire into a chair, her medic instincts kicking in as her eyes scanned her pallor, her shallow breaths, the protective way her arms wrapped around her stomach. She whispered reassurances, not just as a nurse, but as a sister who would not let this cruelty go unanswered. Marcus began to speak, his voice sharp and defensive, accusing Claire of being dramatic, unstable, ungrateful. His excuses filled the hall, but no one was listening. Emily's eyes locked with his, and for the first time, Marcus faltered. Her gaze carried the fire of battlefields, the steel of a woman who had seen men fall and rise again, and he realized in that moment that his power meant nothing here. The hours that followed blurred together. Tests were run, monitors checked, specialists called in. Emily never left her sister's side. Her hand always on Claire's shoulder, her voice a steady anchor in a storm of fear. And when Claire's tears finally spilled, when she whispered that this was not the first time Marcus had raised his hand, Emily's heart broke. But she also knew this was the turning point. Shame had silenced Claire before, fear had kept her bound, but this time was different. She had someone who would fight for her. Marcus tried everything in the days that followed: lavish gifts, desperate apologies, veiled threats. He begged, he raged, he promised. But Claire, with Emily's unwavering presence beside her, began to see through the lies. She began to stand taller, to believe she deserved better. Emily reminded her of the truth she had forgotten: that love without respect is a prison, that no child deserves to grow up watching their mother flinch in fear. The breaking point came weeks later at a hospital charity gala. Marcus showed up uninvited, dressed in arrogance and designer silk, trying to spin his story to the cameras. But when he reached for Claire's hand, Emily stepped between them, her voice calm yet powerful, and told the truth aloud. Gasps filled the room, whispers turned into outrage, and Marcus's carefully built mask shattered in front of everyone. That night, his empire began to crack. Months later, Claire gave birth to a healthy baby. As she cradled her newborn, tears ran down her face, washing away the remnants of fear. Emily stood by her side, her heart full, knowing this was her greatest victory. Not medals earned in war, but the safety and rebirth of her sister's spirit. Life did not become perfect overnight, but Claire, with her sister and her child, began to rebuild a life of dignity and peace. And Emily, scarred by war yet strengthened by love, knew that this battle had been her most important one. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of the courage it takes to stand against cruelty and protect the ones we love, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Stories Collection. And before we end, we have a special request. Comment below what this story left in your heart. Was it courage? Was it the reminder of family? Or was it the hope that healing always follows pain?